The village of Ruinerwold lies in the province of Drenthe, in the rural north of the Netherlands. To an outsider, it is the picture of peace, green fields, brick farmhouses, narrow roads lined with trees. But on the evening of October 13, 2019, a young man walked into a local bar in the village. He was 25 years old, disheveled, and frightened. He told the bartender something that made no sense at first. He said he had run away from home, and that he had never been outside before. The man explained that he and his siblings had been trapped inside their family farm for 9 years. He had finally escaped by prying open a locked door and walking several miles to the nearest town. The bartender, shocked, immediately called the police. When authorities entered the farmhouse later that night, they were confronted with something almost medieval. The main house was cluttered, windows covered, doors nailed shut. Behind a hidden staircase was a secret room, where 6 siblings lived in isolation. The smell of decay lingered in the air. The children, ranging in age from teens to young adults, looked pale and malnourished. According to police reports, they barely knew how to speak with strangers. One child whispered that they had been waiting for the end of time. The figure at the center of this nightmare was not their biological father, but a man named Gerrit Jan van D., often referred to simply as the father. He was 67 years old at the time of discovery. Paralyzed from a stroke, he was found lying in a makeshift bed. Alongside him was a 58-year-old Austrian handyman named Joseph B., who acted as his caretaker and accomplice. Neighbors had always wondered about the farmhouse. Some claimed they saw shadows moving at night, or heard faint noises, but dismissed them as imagination. The property appeared deserted, overgrown, as if nature itself had swallowed it. No one imagined that behind the sealed windows, children were hidden like ghosts. According to documents later released, Van D. had once been part of a fringe religious movement. His obsession with the apocalypse grew over the years, leading him to withdraw from society entirely. He moved his children into the farmhouse and instructed them that the outside world was corrupted. Their only mission was to survive until the end of days. For 9 years, they lived under his rules. They worked the land in secret, grew vegetables, and lived almost entirely off what the farm could provide. When they became sick, there were no doctors. When they grew restless, there was nowhere to run. Their prison was disguised as a home. What disturbed investigators most was how easily this family had vanished in plain sight. There were no missing persons reports. No teachers raising alarms. No official records of the younger children's existence at all. In the words of one Dutch official, it was as if they did not exist. The public reaction was immediate and intense. Journalists camped outside the farmhouse, cameras flashing against the dark silhouette of the home. Some villagers felt guilt. They had lived nearby for years, yet never questioned the strange quiet of the property. Others felt anger at the authorities, demanding to know how such a situation could have persisted in modern Europe. Court documents reveal chilling details. The eldest son, the one who escaped, later testified that the children were beaten if they disobeyed. They were told that stepping outside would invite the wrath of evil forces. At times, they doubted their own sanity. Was the outside world real? Or was it all a lie meant to test them? Medical examinations confirmed years of malnutrition. The children had developmental delays, physical weakness, and psychological scars. Forensic experts described their living conditions as a life frozen in time. But the deeper investigators dug, the stranger the story became. According to some neighbors, the farmhouse was not always silent. A few reported seeing the handyman, Joseph B., arriving late at night with supplies. Others claimed to have seen children staring from behind curtains, but when they looked again, the windows were empty. One local farmer even said he once heard faint singing, like a hymn, drifting from the house at dawn. Police searched for official records of the children. Some birth certificates were missing. School enrollments had never happened. For several of them, no government record existed at all. It was as though their lives had been erased before they began. The father, Van D., had a complicated past. Before his stroke, he was described as a devout, even fanatical man. He believed he alone had been chosen by God to protect his family from a corrupted world. His obsession with doomsday theology grew into an all-consuming paranoia. When questioned by investigators after the raid, he offered little explanation. His words were fragmented, drifting between scripture and prophecy. He died in 2021, leaving many questions unanswered. The farmhouse itself remains a symbol of unease. Its brick walls still stand, its windows still dark. But for many in the village, it is no longer just a house, it is a reminder of how fragile the line is between normal life and hidden horror. What makes this story even more unsettling is how familiar it feels. Families are meant to be safe havens, the first walls of protection against the world. Yet, in this case, the family became the prison, and the father became the jailer. And this was only one case. History is full of them. Families whose secrets remained hidden until one door creaked open, until one voice whispered the truth. Families whose horrors became known only when it was too late. The question is not how this could happen once. The question is, how many more are still out there? It was January 14, 2018, just after midnight, when a trembling voice cut through a 911 dispatcher's line in Riverside County, California. A young girl spoke, hesitant but determined. She was 17 years old. Her name was Jordan. She said she had escaped from her home. And she said her 12 brothers and sisters were still inside, chained to their beds. At first, the dispatcher thought it might be a prank. The girl's words were disjointed, as if she wasn't sure how to describe the outside world she had just stepped into. She explained that she had never really been allowed outdoors. She didn't even know her own address. Police traced her call and arrived at a modest suburban house in Paris, California. The beige, two-story home blended perfectly with its neighbors. Its lawn was unkempt but not alarming. From the outside, it looked like any other family residence. But inside, officers uncovered one of the most horrifying cases of familial abuse in modern American history. According to the official police report, 13 siblings were found living in unimaginable conditions. Their ages ranged from 2 to 29. Some were chained to beds with heavy padlocks. The smell of human waste hung in the air. The children were malnourished, their bodies frail and weak. Many appeared far younger than their actual ages. One officer later said, "It was like walking into a nightmare that you couldn't wake from." The parents, David and Louise Turpin, were arrested immediately. Both appeared strangely calm, even confused, as if they did not understand why the police had come. Neighbors were stunned. They described the Turpins as private, but not outwardly threatening. The family rarely left the house. When they did, it was usually late at night. Some neighbors recalled seeing the children marching in single file, like soldiers, dressed in identical clothing. Others mentioned how pale they looked, their movements awkward, their gazes empty. Yet, no one reported them. The children never attended school. The family claimed to be homeschooling them, but state records showed no official documentation. The children had almost no medical history, no vaccinations, no doctor visits, nothing to suggest they had existed outside those walls. When interviewed later, Jordan explained that she and her siblings were often deprived of food. Their meals consisted of bread, peanut butter, and sometimes frozen food that they were barely allowed to heat. If they tried to take more, they were beaten. Showers were limited to once a year. They were forced to stay awake at night, sleeping during the day. Punishments were brutal. Being chained to a bed for weeks at a time was common. They were told that outsiders were dangerous, that if they tried to escape, they would never survive. For years, these children lived in a world where cruelty was normal, and obedience was survival. Court documents reveal that David and Louise Turpin carefully cultivated a facade of normality. On social media, Louise posted smiling photos of the family at Disneyland and Las Vegas, all dressed in matching clothes. To the outside world, they appeared eccentric but harmless. Behind closed doors, the truth was hidden. When prosecutors presented the case in court, the evidence was overwhelming. The children had been systematically starved, beaten, and denied education for years. Several could not recite the alphabet. Some were so malnourished they could barely walk. A doctor described them as suffering from severe caloric malnutrition, noting that their growth had been stunted. During the trial, the children's voices emerged for the first time. One testified that they were beaten if they washed above the wrists. Another said they were forced to memorize long passages of the Bible and punished if they forgot a single word. Perhaps most haunting was the psychological manipulation. The children were told that their suffering was part of God's will, and that obedience would bring them salvation. In this way, David and Louise cast themselves not just as parents, but as prophets. In April 2019, both were sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 25 years. As the verdict was read, some of the children addressed the court. Despite everything, a few expressed love for their parents. Others described fear, but also hope that their future might finally be free. But what unsettles investigators, even now, is how long it went unnoticed. The Turpins lived in plain sight, in a suburban neighborhood, surrounded by families, mail carriers, delivery drivers. Authorities admitted that no social services check ever penetrated their home. School officials never flagged their absence. Neighbors never called. According to Riverside County authorities, the family had previously lived in Texas. There, similar complaints had surfaced, but nothing was followed through. In one case, a neighbor saw children inside the house at night, marching in circles for hours. He thought it was strange, but dismissed it. Another noticed that windows were covered, lights kept on at odd hours. Again, nothing was done. In retrospect, the warning signs were everywhere. Yet, like so many of these cases, the facade of family prevented suspicion. One criminologist explained it this way. People assume that the family is the safest place. It's the last place they expect to find monsters. The Turpin children are now adults, living in foster care or with supportive families. Their recovery is ongoing. Some struggle with the basics of independence, such as crossing the street or cooking meals. Others have spoken publicly about their resilience, their determination to create new lives. Still, the haunting truth remains. For decades, a family existed in the middle of America, hidden in plain sight. Their home was not a home. It was a prison. Their parents were not protectors. They were captors. And it was only by accident, one brave child slipping into the night, clutching a stolen phone, that the world learned of their suffering. The story of the Tepins reveals the dark paradox of family. To neighbors, they were just another household. To the children inside, they were the walls that kept them caged. And as horrifying as this case was, history shows it was not unique. Across continents, across centuries, other families have hidden equally disturbing secrets, secrets that only emerged when the walls cracked, and the truth came pouring out. In the remote hills of southern Chile, far from the scrutiny of cities and governments, a strange community took root in the early 1960s. It called itself Colonia Dignidad, the colony of dignity. To outsiders, it appeared to be a religious settlement, a group of German immigrants seeking a simple and pious life. They tilled the land, raised livestock, and built tidy houses along dusty roads. Visitors described an air of discipline, order, and austerity. Children dressed in identical uniforms. Men and women lived separately, speaking little and working hard. At first glance, it resembled a large extended family, bound by faith and tradition. But beneath the facade of devotion lay one of the darkest chapters in modern history. According to survivors and official inquiries, Colonia Dignidad was not a refuge, it was a prison. A self-contained world where abuse was systemic, secrecy was enforced, and children were raised in an atmosphere of fear. The man behind it all was Paul Schaefer, a former German lay preacher. He had fled West Germany amid allegations of child abuse. When scrutiny grew too intense, he disappeared with his followers, promising them a new beginning in South America. In 1961, they arrived in Chile, where they purchased a vast tract of land near the town of Parral. Schaefer styled himself as the patriarch of a new family, a community that would reject the corrupt outside world. He imposed strict rules, men and women were segregated, marriages dissolved, and children separated from their parents. Schaefer declared that all children belonged not to their mothers and fathers, but to the colony itself, to him. According to official testimony, parents were allowed almost no contact with their own children. Infants were taken away within months of birth and raised communally. Schaefer presented himself as their ultimate father figure, demanding absolute obedience. The daily life of Colonia Dignidad was rigid and severe. Work began before sunrise and stretched late into the evening. Food was rationed, luxuries forbidden. The colony's propaganda presented this as virtuous simplicity, a rejection of modern decadence. In reality, it was a system designed to control. Survivors described punishments that bordered on the medieval. Those who questioned Schaefer were beaten, drugged, or locked away in underground cells. Children were subjected to medical treatments that were little more than torture. Electric shocks, forced sedations, and brutal isolation were all documented in later investigations. But the most horrifying allegations centered on Schaefer himself. Multiple testimonies, court records, and survivor interviews detail decades of systematic sexual abuse of children. The colony's strict segregation allowed him unchecked access. His authority was absolute, to defy him was to risk everything. For years, the Chilean government looked the other way. Colonia Dignidad presented itself as a model community, providing free medical services to locals, producing food, and supporting conservative causes. Officials visited the colony and were impressed by its apparent orderliness. Some even praised it as an example of German discipline transplanted into South America. Behind closed doors, the truth was hidden. The colony's isolation worked in Schaefer's favor. Located on thousands of acres of rural land, surrounded by fences and guard posts, it was nearly impossible to enter without permission. Outsiders were watched closely. Children were instructed never to speak of what happened inside. The dictatorship of Augusto Pinochet, which began in 1973, only deepened the darkness. Evidence later revealed that Colonia Dignidad became a site of collaboration between Schaefer's colony and Pinochet's secret police, the DINA. Political dissidents were brought to the colony's grounds, where they were tortured and disappeared. Survivors speak of screams echoing in underground bunkers. To this day, not all the victims have been identified. According to declassified Chilean documents, Colonia Dignidad functioned as both a cult and a state-sanctioned prison. Schaefer provided services to the dictatorship, and in return, the dictatorship shielded him from investigation. It was not until the 1990s, after Pinochet's fall from power, that cracks began to appear. Former members escaped and spoke publicly. Journalists published exposés. Families of missing political prisoners demanded answers. Slowly, the truth emerged. In 1997, Schaefer fled Chile after an arrest warrant was issued for child abuse. He was finally captured in Argentina in 2005 and extradited. In 2006, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison for sexual abuse of minors. He died in prison in 2010, never facing trial for the full range of crimes committed under his rule. The aftermath of Colonia Dignidad still haunts Chile. Survivors struggle with trauma, their childhood stolen by a man who convinced their parents to surrender them. Families of disappeared dissidents still search the colony's grounds, hoping to recover remains. Government inquiries have admitted complicity, acknowledging that officials turned a blind eye for decades. Today, the colony has been renamed Villa Baviera. It operates partly as a tourist site, offering restaurants and hotels, as if its past could be erased by rebranding. For some survivors, this commercialization is an insult, a reminder that their suffering has been folded into a spectacle. For others, it is an attempt to confront the past openly. But the legacy of Colonia Dignidad is clear, a so-called family that became a machinery of control, abuse, and death. What makes it even more disturbing is how familiar its structure feels. A patriarch who demanded loyalty. Parents persuaded to relinquish their own children. Outsiders unwilling to look too closely. A society that preferred the illusion of order to the confrontation of truth. According to one survivor, interviewed decades later. We were told it was a family. But families protect. Here, the family was the danger. The story of Colonia Dignidad expands the definition of family horror. It was no longer a single household, hidden behind suburban walls or rural farmhouses. It was an entire community, living under the illusion of kinship, while secrecy and cruelty reigned. And like the farmhouse in the Netherlands, like the suburban prison in California, it survived for so long because the world outside chose not to see. In July of 2012, child welfare workers were dispatched to a remote valley in New South Wales, Australia. Their assignment seemed routine: investigate reports of children living in poor conditions on an isolated farm. The workers expected neglect, perhaps poverty. What they found was something far darker. The valley was remote, accessible only by dirt roads that wound through the hills. A cluster of makeshift shacks stood on the property, cobbled together from plywood, metal sheets, and tarps. No running water. No toilets. No electricity. Inside the huts, workers found dozens of children. Many were filthy, barefoot, and malnourished. Some could not speak intelligibly. Others had deformities. At first, investigators could not make sense of what they were seeing. But medical examinations soon revealed the truth. This was not just poverty. This was incest, on a scale few could comprehend. The family was known as the Colts, a pseudonym given by the courts to protect the children's identities. Across 4 generations, brothers and sisters, parents and children, uncles and nieces had intermarried and interbred. The result was a web of incest so complex that it was nearly impossible to untangle who was whose parent. According to official court records, nearly every child examined showed evidence of genetic abnormalities. Some had stunted growth, others facial deformities, speech impairments, and severe learning disabilities. One doctor described their condition as the most appalling case of incest ever seen in Australia. The children had never been to school. They did not know how to brush their teeth, use a toilet, or read. Their vocabulary was limited to a handful of words. Many had never seen a doctor in their lives. The adults lived nearby, in separate huts, but still within the same valley. When questioned, they spoke of the outside world with suspicion. They said they had chosen isolation to avoid persecution. But their secrecy had allowed abuse to continue, generation after generation. According to testimonies, sexual relationships between relatives were normalized within the family. Children grew up believing it was ordinary. Those who resisted were punished or ostracized. In this way, silence was enforced. The Colt case shocked Australia when it came to light in 2013. Journalists described it as a clan hidden in the hills, a family whose very structure had become corrupted. Court hearings were held behind closed doors to protect the children, but fragments of the story leaked into the press. The public was horrified. How could such a family exist in the 21st century, in a developed nation, without detection? The answer lay partly in geography. The Colts moved often, shifting between remote rural properties. Each time suspicion grew, they disappeared into another valley. They avoided towns, schools, and hospitals. Local authorities admitted that the family had been reported multiple times over the years, but jurisdictional confusion and lack of follow-through allowed them to slip away. In one chilling report, welfare workers noted that the children seemed to fear outsiders. When questioned, they clung to each other, glancing nervously at the adults. Their world was so small, so controlled, that the idea of escape was unimaginable. Forensic genetic testing later confirmed what doctors suspected: multiple generations of incest had occurred. The children's DNA carried signatures of extreme consanguinity, some as close as parent-to-child or sibling-to-sibling pairings. The courts removed the children from the valley. Many were placed in foster care, beginning the long process of rehabilitation. But the trauma was profound. Years of neglect, abuse, and indoctrination left scars that no intervention could fully erase. The adults, however, largely evaded justice. Because of the complexities of family ties, and the lack of concrete testimony from traumatized children, prosecutions were limited. Some adults denied wrongdoing. Others simply refused to cooperate. To this day, many details remain suppressed by court order. The Colt family became a symbol, not just of incest, but of the horror that can flourish in secrecy. It was not the first such case, nor the last. Across history, similar stories have surfaced. In the Austrian Alps, in the American Appalachians, in isolated villages across Europe, whispers of incestuous clans have long circulated. Most fade into rumor. The Colts showed what happens when rumor becomes reality. Psychologists who studied the case noted how the family structure itself had been weaponized. The children's loyalty was bound to those who abused them, because those abusers were also their parents, their siblings, their only family. Love and horror were inseparably entwined. One criminologist described it chillingly. The family became a closed loop. There was no outside. No new blood. No escape. They were their own captors. The Colt case forces us to confront the darkest possibility, that family, when turned inward, can become something monstrous. The bonds that should protect children can also chain them to abuse. And when those chains are reinforced by isolation, secrecy, and silence, they can last for generations. Perhaps most unsettling of all is how ordinary the huts appeared at first glance, ramshackle, poor, but not remarkable. Behind their thin walls, however, was a world cut off from society, a world where incest was tradition, and children were born into cages they could not see. The horror of the Colts was not only the abuse itself, but the invisibility. Authorities had passed near them, neighbors had glimpsed them, reports had been made. And yet, until the raid in 2012, no one truly saw. How many other valleys, how many other families, remain hidden? According to official records, the cult that would become known simply as the family began in Melbourne, Australia, in the 1960s. To outsiders, it appeared to be a spiritual movement, a small religious group gathered around a charismatic woman named Anne Hamilton Byrne. But to those inside, especially the children raised under her control, it was something far darker. Anne, a former yoga teacher with striking blonde hair and a piercing gaze, proclaimed herself the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. To her followers, she was not merely a prophet, she was a living deity, a mother to all. They called her the Great White Brotherhood's chosen one. But beneath the surface of her mysticism lay something calculated, manipulative, and cruel. At the heart of Anne's vision was the idea of a perfect family. She convinced her followers to adopt or surrender children, who were then raised together in secret rural properties, most notably at a compound in Lake Eildon. The children were dressed identically, pale blue dresses for the girls, tailored tunics for the boys. Their hair was bleached blonde to resemble Anne herself. To the outside world, they looked like siblings. In truth, many were unrelated, collected from broken homes, coerced adoptions, and in some cases outright fraud. According to survivor testimonies, the children were indoctrinated from their earliest memories. They were told Anne was their mother, that she was divine, that disobedience would damn them forever. They were forced into strict routines, chanting, meditation, hours of silence. But when obedience faltered, punishment was severe. They were beaten with sticks, locked in rooms for days, starved, and humiliated. Even more disturbing was Anne's use of drugs. Documents later revealed that psychiatrists loyal to her cult administered powerful hallucinogens, including LSD, to both adults and children. These sessions were described as spiritual purification. In reality, they shattered minds, broke wills, and deepened dependence on Anne. Former followers would later recall how children as young as 14 were given doses of LSD under supervision, forced to confront terrifying hallucinations while being told Anne was the only safe harbor. Anne's reach extended beyond her compounds. She cultivated doctors, nurses, and lawyers who shielded the cult from scrutiny. According to official investigations, medical professionals falsified birth records to conceal adoptions, creating a paper trail that made it nearly impossible to trace the children's origins. For years, Australian authorities knew rumours of a secretive group existed, but evidence was scarce. Whenever questions arose, Anne's network of loyalists closed ranks. To neighbors near the Lake Eildon property, the family appeared odd but not criminal. They saw children walking in identical clothes, pale and silent, rarely making eye contact. But suspicion was brushed aside. Few dared to believe that such horrors could be unfolding in a quiet, pastoral setting. Inside, the children dreamed of escape. Survivors later described how they whispered in the dark, sharing their longing for freedom, daring each other to defy Anne's control. Some tried to flee, but fear always drove them back, fear of punishment, fear of the outside world they had been told was dangerous and corrupt, and above all, fear of Anne's wrath. By the 1980s, whispers about the cult had grown louder. Journalists began to investigate. In 1987, Victoria Police finally raided the Lake Eildon property. What they found confirmed the darkest suspicions: dozens of children, pale and traumatized, living under Anne's absolute rule. Documents, drug records, falsified papers, the evidence was overwhelming. But justice did not come easily. And Hamilton Byrne fled overseas, evading arrest for years. The children, suddenly free, were thrust into a world they did not understand. Many had never attended school, never spoken freely, never made a choice for themselves. Some were placed in foster care, others struggled with trauma for decades. Their testimonies would later reveal scars far deeper than physical wounds, an unshakable sense of betrayal by the very person who had called herself mother. When Anne was finally arrested in 1993 in the United States, she was extradited to Australia. But her trial became a bitter disappointment to many. Due to gaps in evidence and the passage of time, she and her closest aides were convicted only of minor fraud charges relating to falsified documents. The abuse, the druggings, the years of control, much of it went unpunished. And served no prison time. For survivors, this was a cruel echo of their childhoods: silence, denial, and dismissal from the authorities who should have protected them. Some described feeling as though the cult never truly ended, because justice was never served. Anne lived out her final years in relative comfort, fading into dementia before her death in 2019. To the world, she became a footnote, a bizarre chapter in Australia's history. But to those she raised, to the children who lost their childhoods in her pursuit of a perfect family, the scars remain permanent. The family's story raises haunting questions. How could a woman with no official power convince doctors, lawyers, and ordinary parents to surrender everything to her? How could so many children be hidden in plain sight, their very identities erased? And how many other families, behind closed doors, operate with the same absolute control, concealed by loyalty and silence? According to investigators, some of Anne's inner circle never fully broke away. Rumors persist that splinter groups still exist, following fragments of her teachings. Whether or not those whispers are true, one fact cannot be denied: the idea of family, when corrupted into a cult, becomes something monstrous. What should be a sanctuary becomes a weapon. What should be a bond of love becomes a chain. And in the case of Anne Hamilton Burns' family, that chain was draped in the language of holiness, twisted into devotion, and tightened until children could scarcely breathe. As one survivor said, decades after the compound was dismantled, when you are told your whole life that your mother is God, you do not escape her. Even when she is gone, she is still inside you. According to official records, Jim Jones was once a man praised for his compassion. In the 1950s and 60s, he was seen as a progressive preacher, a man who spoke of racial equality when segregation still ruled much of America. His church, the People's Temple, presented itself as a family for the forgotten, a haven for the poor, the outcast, and the lost. But what began as a vision of brotherhood would descend into one of the darkest tragedies of the 20th century. Jones called his congregation children. He referred to himself as Father. And to thousands, that was exactly what he became, the head of a sprawling spiritual family. They sang together, worked together, ate together. Members surrendered their property, their paychecks, even their wills, trusting that Father would guide them into a better world. For many, the People's Temple was their family. And yet, behind the music, the smiles, and the promises of justice, Jim Jones was constructing a house of horror brick by brick. As early as the mid-1960s, Jones began isolating his followers. Those who lived in temple communes were instructed to cut ties with relatives who criticized the church. Letters were censored. Families were told that blood ties meant nothing compared to spiritual ones. Father was their true parent now. Children were raised communally, often disciplined harshly by adults who were not their own parents. According to survivor testimonies, Jones demanded complete obedience. Dissent was punished with public humiliation, beatings, and sleep deprivation. The deeper members surrendered, the more Jones demanded. He introduced loyalty tests, mock suicide drills, late-night confessions where followers revealed their most private sins. These were recorded, used later to ensure silence. Couples were forced to split and remarry according to Jones's orders. Biological families were deliberately fractured so that the only unshakable loyalty remaining was to Jim himself. In the early 1970s, the temple expanded. Jones was celebrated in the media as a civil rights leader. He shook hands with politicians, built social programs, and ran nursing homes. Yet within those same nursing homes, vulnerable elderly members were pressured to sign over their estates to the church. Their final years were not spent with family, but in the service of Father. By the late 1970s, pressure from journalists and defectors grew. Allegations of abuse, financial fraud, and coercion reached the headlines. In response, Jones moved his congregation to a remote settlement in Guyana, South America. He called it Jonestown, a promised land where the People's Temple would live as one great family, free from the corruption of the outside world. But Jonestown was no paradise. According to survivor accounts, life there was grueling. Families lived in cramped huts. Food was scarce, water was contaminated, medicine was limited. Children were taught to chant slogans praising Father. Loudspeakers blasted Jones's voice day and night, reminding them that enemies lurked beyond the jungle. Escape was impossible. The family dynamic became absolute. Biological parents had no say over their children, all were considered the offspring of Jim Jones. He alone decided discipline, education, and even who could marry. Followers worked endless hours in the fields, surviving on meager rations, while Jones indulged in imported luxuries. Anyone who spoke of leaving was accused of betrayal, not just against the church, but against the family itself. And then came November 18, 1978. When U.S. Congressman Leo Ryan traveled to Jonestown to investigate reports of abuse, several members begged him to take them away. As Ryan and his delegation prepared to leave, Jones's armed guards attacked, killing the congressman and 4 others. Back in Jonestown, Jones gathered his followers in the central pavilion. What happened next is preserved in a haunting audio recording. Jones spoke calmly, insisting that enemies would soon invade, that death was the only escape. He urged parents to bring their children forward first. Cyanide-laced punch was distributed. Mothers and fathers administered it to their own sons and daughters. Screams filled the air as children convulsed. Then the adults drank. Over 900 people died that night, including nearly 300 children. It remains the largest loss of American civilian life in a deliberate act until September 11, 2001. The world would forever remember the phrase, "drinking the Kool-Aid." But beneath that cliché lies the raw horror of families torn apart, twisted into obedience, convinced to kill their own flesh and blood for the man they called father. The People's Temple was not the only example of religion reshaping family into nightmare. Other groups followed similar patterns. In the 1990s, the Branch Davidians of Waco, Texas, gathered around David Koresh, a man who declared himself both prophet and father. He restructured families by claiming spiritual marriages to multiple women, some underage. Biological fathers were stripped of their roles, children were raised under Koresh's authoritarian gaze. When federal agents laid siege to the compound in 1993, a fire consumed the building, killing 76 people, including dozens of children. Further back, in small religious sects across Europe, stories repeat. Leaders claim divine authority, dismantle traditional families, and replace them with structures of control. In many cases, children are the first to suffer, raised without autonomy, denied education, told that their salvation depends on obedience to the father or mother of the sect. What unites these groups is a chilling formula: isolation, control, secrecy. The replacement of family bonds with loyalty to a single leader. Once those bonds are broken, the leader's power becomes nearly absolute. Parents become enforcers. Children become property. The home, or the commune, or the compound, becomes a cage. The tragedy of Jonestown, Waco, and countless lesser-known sects lies not only in the deaths, but in the betrayal of the most sacred trust. Family is meant to protect. But in these houses of horror, it was turned into the very instrument of destruction. As one Jonestown survivor said, recalling the night she lost her entire family, "They told us Father would protect us. But in the end, he was the one who killed us." Across Europe, behind the walls of stately manors and opulent castles, some of the most horrifying family secrets were carefully concealed. In the public eye, these households were models of wealth, culture, and tradition. But within their halls, the bonds of kinship were twisted into instruments of control, fear, and sometimes murder. According to historical records, many noble families placed appearances above all else. The facade of perfection mattered more than the welfare of the children, the spouses, or even the aging patriarchs and matriarchs. Etiquette, inheritance, and lineage often trumped morality. In some cases, abuse became normalized, and secrecy became a family religion. Take, for example, the 17th century case of the Borgia family in Italy. To the public, they were patrons of the arts, defenders of the church, and key players in European politics. But historians have long documented rumors of corruption, poisoning, and incest among the Borgias. Children were pawns in marriage arrangements, tools for political gain, and in some accounts, victims of sexual exploitation orchestrated by those they were meant to trust the most. While concrete evidence is limited, much of it destroyed or never recorded, the patterns of secrecy and manipulation are undeniable. In England, during the 18th century, there were noble families whose estates were cloaked in silence. Letters discovered in private archives describe children confined to hidden nurseries, subject to strict rules, and often left to their own devices for days at a time. Servants spoke of beatings, isolation, and cruelty, yet their testimonies were buried or ignored to protect the family's reputation. One historian notes, the punishment of children was often codified in silence, a tradition handed down from generation to generation. Some families practiced what might be called psychological imprisonment. Parents would enforce strict hierarchies, ensuring that children were constantly monitored and never allowed privacy. Knowledge of the outside world was filtered, limited, and distorted. Education was selective, intended to preserve loyalty, not curiosity. Dissent was punished not only physically but socially, with shame, isolation, or false accusations designed to turn siblings against one another. In France, the Maison de la Famille in the late 19th century, a prominent aristocratic household in rural Brittany, exhibited similar patterns. Diaries and estate records reveal that children were frequently locked in rooms for moral correction, sometimes for days. Servants' notes describe food rationing as a form of discipline, parents visiting rarely, and tutors who doubled as enforcers of strict obedience. The family's outward reputation remained impeccable, their wealth and social influence shielding them from suspicion. The most chilling aspect of these European cases is how invisible the abuse was. In many instances, neighbors, clergy, and even local authorities suspected nothing. Outsiders saw polished faces at the windows, gardens maintained perfectly, and elegant carriages arriving and departing. Behind the walls, however, children were punished for trivial missteps, siblings were turned against each other, and secrecy was enforced with subtlety, a whispered threat, a cold glance, a sudden withdrawal of affection. Some families went further, creating entire myths to justify cruelty. Children were told they were sinful, unworthy, or cursed. Sometimes these narratives were reinforced by religious texts, local legends, or the selective teachings of tutors and governesses. The child's mind became a tool, molded by fear and the authority of blood. In such households, survival depended on compliance, obedience, and silence. Historians point to one recurring theme: isolation. Even when families lived in towns or cities, the inner family life was hermetically sealed. Governesses, nannies, and tutors served as both caretakers and enforcers, ensuring that secrets remained hidden. Outsiders were welcome only under controlled conditions. Invitations were rare, letters censored, and visitors carefully monitored. The very architecture of these homes, hidden rooms, locked stairwells, and secret passageways, facilitated secrecy. Consider the case of a minor German noble family in the early 20th century, whose letters were uncovered decades later. Children were punished for speaking to each other without permission, and siblings were instructed to report on one another. Meals were regimented, education was selective, and deviations from the strict family code were met with public humiliation or solitary confinement. The world outside, the streets, the schools, the markets, existed only as rumor, filtered through the family lens. Even when abuse was suspected, authorities often failed to intervene. Social norms, respect for nobility, and the fear of scandal meant that complaints went ignored. Families who violated the unwritten moral code of appearance risked nothing more than gossip. In this way, horror could persist, generation after generation, invisible to outsiders yet etched indelibly into the lives of the children within. Some of the most haunting evidence comes from private journals and letters. Children described their own parents as both protectors and torturers. They wrote of being afraid of smiles as well as scowls, unsure which gestures meant safety and which heralded punishment. They described meals as rituals of humiliation, rooms as prisons, and birthdays as lessons in obedience. In one diary, a child wrote, "I never knew the outside. I do not remember a day without fear. And yet I was loved, or I was told I was loved." The lesson from these historical families is unsettling. Evil does not always announce itself with grand gestures. Often, it creeps quietly behind closed doors, sustained by wealth, tradition, and social respect. Children can be trapped in plain sight, victims of a system that elevates appearances over welfare. Families, when corrupted by secrecy, hierarchy, and obsession, can become cages, gilded, ornate cages, where innocence is systematically stripped away. And yet, despite centuries of evidence, the pattern persists. From the aristocratic estates of Europe to modern suburban households, the danger remains, that the family, which is meant to nurture, can be weaponized. That the bonds meant to protect can become instruments of control. That behind closed doors, horrors can flourish, unseen, for decades. As historians, journalists, and survivors have shown, the secrecy of these families is the key to their power. When walls, gates, and etiquette prevent the world from seeing inside, abuse becomes almost invisible. And history demonstrates, time and again, that invisible abuse is often the most enduring, and the most horrifying. The suburbs are supposed to be safe. Green lawns, tidy sidewalks, picket fences, these are symbols of normalcy, of families that function without fear. But history and contemporary reports remind us that terror does not always announce itself in castles, compounds, or remote valleys. Sometimes it festers behind beige siding and freshly painted doors, invisible to neighbors, friends, and even authorities. In 2018, the world first learned of the Turpin family in Paris, California. 13 children, some chained to beds, others malnourished, had been held captive by their own parents for decades. Neighbors had seen the children, pale, thin, silent, yet assumed the oddities were eccentricities, not abuse. This case shocked the world precisely because it happened in the suburbs, among ordinary streets and ordinary people. But the Turpins were far from an isolated anomaly. Across the United States, Europe, and Australia, investigators have uncovered dozens of cases in which parents isolated, abused, or otherwise controlled their children while presenting a veneer of normalcy. Homes where children were never allowed to speak to outsiders. Homes where strict rules were enforced with fear, secrecy, and ritualized punishment. Homes where the family itself became a prison. Take, for instance, the case of David and Louise Turpin in more detail. They homeschooled their children, forbade them from bathing regularly, and required them to wear identical clothing. Food was rationed, and punishments were severe, sometimes chained to furniture for weeks. Yet to the casual observer, the Turpins were merely private, perhaps overly strict, parents. The horror was entirely invisible until one daughter broke free and called the authorities. Isolation was always a critical element. Many modern suburban abusers employ similar tactics. Children are withdrawn from schools or extracurricular activities. They are forbidden to speak to relatives or neighbors. Monitors, surveillance, and intimidation reinforce obedience. Homes, which should be sites of comfort and safety, are transformed into laboratories of control. Even when outsiders suspect abuse, denial often intervenes. Neighbors rationalize strange behavior, the parents are just strict, they keep to themselves, it's none of our business. Authorities sometimes dismiss warnings due to a lack of concrete evidence. The family, cloaked in normalcy, becomes nearly impervious to outside scrutiny. In Australia, for example, social workers discovered families where children were hidden in basements, deprived of education, and forced to obey bizarre rituals. Similar patterns emerged in the United Kingdom, where authorities encountered households in which children had never attended school and were punished for the most minor missteps. Often, these cases involved multiple generations of secrecy. Parents who had suffered abuse themselves perpetuated the cycle, convinced that strict control or deprivation was a form of protection. Psychologists studying these families note that the dynamics are disturbingly similar to historical cases. Fear replaces love. Obedience replaces curiosity. Silence replaces communication. Children are indoctrinated to equate safety with submission and danger with independence. Their world becomes extraordinarily small, and any glimpse beyond the walls is terrifying. Modern technology complicates matters. While social media and smartphones have increased oversight in some cases, they also offer tools for control. Parents can monitor internet activity, isolate children virtually, and reinforce rules with electronic surveillance. The mechanisms of abuse evolve, but the principles remain: secrecy, fear, and control. Some families impose ritualized routines. Children must eat, sleep, and play according to precise schedules. Minor infractions, speaking out of turn, expressing curiosity, resisting obedience, can result in severe punishments. Psychologists call this hyperregulation, a form of psychological imprisonment that keeps children compliant without leaving visible bruises. A particularly chilling aspect is the normalization of abuse within these households. Children often perceive cruelty as ordinary, even as expressions of care. Obedience is framed as virtue. Submission is framed as love. By the time authorities intervene, many children have internalized the logic of their own captivity. Rescue is not merely a matter of opening doors, it is a lifelong struggle to disentangle trauma from the very notions of family, loyalty, and love. Suburban horror also highlights society's complicity. Communities pride themselves on privacy, respecting fences and doors. Neighbors assume that what happens behind closed doors is sacred and self-regulated. Schools, social services, and law enforcement are sometimes ill-equipped to detect abuse when appearances conform to cultural expectations of family life. In this way, horror hides in plain sight, sustained by the very trust and civility that society values. Some cases escalate beyond physical abuse into ritualized or criminalized behaviors. Children may be coerced into criminal acts to maintain family secrecy. Sexual abuse, drug use, and forced labor can occur under the guise of discipline or morality. Families enforce codes of silence that mirror the structures seen in cults, communes, and historical aristocratic households. The lineage of horror persists, simply in a new, suburbanized form. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is that suburban horrors are nearly invisible until they are breached, until a single child escapes, a neighbor reports suspicions, or a system finally acts. And even then, the scars endure. Survivors often struggle with trust, autonomy, and self-identity. The family, which should have been a source of safety, has become an indelible source of trauma. In these cases, horror is not dramatic or overt. There are no castles, no compounds, no leaders proclaiming divinity. The terror is subtle, quiet, and continuous. A home that looks ordinary, a neighborhood that looks ordinary, a family that looks ordinary, and yet inside, a private apocalypse unfolds. The lessons are haunting. Families, whether noble or suburban, isolated or public, can become prisons when secrecy, fear, and control replace love. Modern technology, cultural norms, and social deference may conceal abuse, but the underlying dynamics remain unchanged. History repeats itself in quiet homes across the globe, hidden behind doors, lawns, and polite facades. And so, as we walk past quiet streets, glance into tidy windows, or hear the laughter of children in parks, we are reminded, sometimes, the most terrifying families are the ones you never suspect. The ones that wear the mask of normalcy. The ones that hide their horrors not in dungeons, but in plain sight. Isolation is a powerful enabler of horror. The farther a family is removed from neighbors, authorities, or public scrutiny, the easier it becomes for cruelty, secrecy, and obsession to flourish. In rural landscapes, among fields, forests, and mountains, the trappings of normalcy dissolve. There is no one to witness, no one to intervene, no one to question. And sometimes, these families exist for decades, leaving children trapped in worlds the outside can scarcely imagine. One of the most notorious cases is the Colt family in Australia, discovered in 2012. For years, the family lived in a remote valley in New South Wales, almost entirely cut off from society. Children wandered barefoot, emaciated and pale. Many were unable to speak properly, others displayed severe genetic deformities, a result of generations of incest. According to court documents, nearly every adult in the family was both parent and sibling to the next generation, creating a web of relations so complex that officials struggled to trace basic lineage. The isolation was deliberate. The Colts moved frequently, seeking valleys, forests, and farms beyond the reach of local authorities. They avoided schools, hospitals, and neighbors. Even when reports were filed over the years, jurisdictional confusion and the family's mobility allowed them to remain hidden. What was extraordinary was not only the abuse itself but the extreme cunning with which the family shielded its horrors from the outside world. A similar pattern emerges in the Netherlands, where, in the late 20th century, authorities uncovered a family living in remote farmland. Children were chained, starved, and forbidden to attend school. The patriarch claimed divine authority, the matriarch enforced obedience, and the family presented an outwardly ordinary facade when passing villagers caught sight of them, greetings at the gate, minimal interaction, the illusion of civility. For decades, the isolation allowed the abuse to continue unnoticed. Isolation magnifies every form of control. Children in these rural households often have limited language, understanding only the commands and vocabulary imposed by their captors. Their worldview is shaped entirely by the adults who dominate their lives. There are no peers, no teachers, no distant relatives, only the family. Escape is not simply physical, it is conceptual. The world beyond the valley or farmhouse may be as terrifying as the punishment awaiting disobedience. In many isolated families, abuse is codified as tradition. Punishments are ritualized, designed to enforce hierarchy. Food may be rationed to instill compliance. Sleep deprivation, constant labor, or isolation from siblings and peers is used to break resistance. In extreme cases, children are prevented from speaking, reading, or even acknowledging their own names, a method to erase identity and enforce total dependence. Medical neglect is another recurring element. Families like the Colts often avoid doctors entirely, resulting in malnutrition, untreated injuries, and untreated genetic conditions. Children may develop chronic illnesses that go unnoticed. The isolation is physical, yes, but also intellectual and emotional. Knowledge of the outside world is minimal, often filtered through a lens of fear or ideology imposed by the parents. The architecture of these households often facilitates secrecy. Basements, hidden rooms, fenced enclosures, and remote cottages create a labyrinthine world where adults monitor every movement. Even casual visitors, if they occur, may not grasp the full extent of what transpires inside. What appears to be an ordinary barn or storage shed may conceal months or years of captivity. One chilling account comes from a small valley in Chile, where a family was discovered living entirely off the grid in the 1980s. Children had never been to school, had never seen a doctor, and spoke only the limited language dictated by their parents. Neighbors described them as pale, withdrawn, almost invisible. Investigators later found evidence of both psychological and physical abuse, a strict code enforced through fear and isolation. Though details remain scarce, this family illustrates the universality of the phenomenon. Isolated rural families provide fertile ground for horror, regardless of culture or continent. Isolation also creates a sense of inevitability for the children. The world outside seems remote, dangerous, or impossible to reach. Inhabitants of these families often describe the valley, farm, or forest as the entire universe. When escape is attempted, it is rare, dangerous, and psychologically overwhelming. Even when authorities intervene, trauma lingers, the children may distrust outsiders, fear freedom, or remain psychologically bound to their captors. Rural isolation can also protect families from digital or social scrutiny. Modern surveillance, social services, and education systems may monitor urban or suburban households, but distant valleys, highlands, and forests often lie beyond the radar. For families bent on secrecy, this is an advantage. Cameras, neighbors, and online postings cannot penetrate the wilderness. In this environment, abuse can continue for generations, virtually unobserved. Yet isolation is not just geographical, it is psychological. Children are indoctrinated to fear outsiders, told that the world beyond the valley is hostile, evil, or incomprehensible. The parents or heads of the household claim sole authority over morality, knowledge, and survival. This total control ensures that even if a path exists, few children dare take it. Compliance becomes survival, fear becomes loyalty, and captivity becomes normalized. What binds these isolated families together is often a combination of ideology, tradition, and secrecy. Religious beliefs, eccentric philosophies, or even twisted notions of family purity may provide a framework for abuse. Older children may be enlisted as enforcers, tasked with disciplining siblings. Fear, manipulation, and isolation create a closed loop, one that strengthens with each generation. Despite the horrors, some survivors manage escape. Their stories illuminate the extraordinary resilience of children in extreme conditions. They recount the terror of leaving, the shock of encountering a normal world, and the lifelong struggle to rebuild identity. They describe their parents not simply as abusers, but as the only world they ever knew, a paradox that haunts them even decades later. The lesson is grim and persistent: isolation magnifies cruelty, secrecy protects horror, and ordinary landscapes can conceal extraordinary abuse. Valleys, forests, and rural towns may seem serene, but they have harbored families whose very structure became a prison. In these places, children are born into captivity, sometimes without ever knowing the meaning of freedom, until chance, courage, or the failure of secrecy allows them to escape. And so, the horrors of isolated rural families are a reminder that geography, culture, and time do not prevent abuse. They only change its form. Behind every remote farmhouse or hidden valley may lie generations of secrecy, fear, and control, waiting to be uncovered, exposing the fragility of what we assume is normal, and the darkness that can exist in the world's most tranquil corners. We began this journey with a simple question: what is a family? A place of warmth, protection, and love, we assumed. Yet we have seen that the same walls meant to shelter children can also imprison them. The same hands meant to nurture can also manipulate, dominate, and destroy. Across centuries, continents, and cultures, the family has proven itself capable of both extraordinary care and unimaginable cruelty. In castles, compounds, and quiet suburban streets, the horror has followed a familiar pattern: control, secrecy, ritual, and fear. Children internalize obedience, loyalty is weaponized, and love is redefined as compliance. In some cases, punishment is physical, overt, and terrifying. In others, it is subtle, psychological, and insidious, leaving scars invisible to the eye but indelibly etched on the mind. In every scenario, the family becomes a laboratory of human behavior, an ecosystem of power in which innocence is captive and trust becomes a tool. Perhaps the most haunting fact is that most of these horrors were uncovered only by accident. A chance phone call, a frightened escape, a neighbor's suspicion, and suddenly the hidden world is exposed. For decades, sometimes generations, these families operated entirely in secrecy. Neighbors, schools, religious institutions, and social services often had no idea. The ordinary facades, neat lawns, tidy kitchens, smiling parents, concealed unimaginable suffering. The world assumes normalcy because normalcy is easier to believe than the alternative. And yet, despite intervention, despite rescue, the legacy persists. Survivors carry trauma long after the doors are unlocked. Fear, obedience, and loyalty endure in the mind, long after the body is free. Even the children who escape must navigate the paradoxical reality that the very structure meant to protect them was the one that caused their deepest pain. Family can be sanctuary, yes. But it can also be the most intimate and enduring of prisons. We are left with questions that may never have answers. How many families exist today behind closed doors, perfectly ordinary in appearance, yet harboring hidden cruelty? How many children remain trapped, unseen, unheard, and powerless? How many stories will remain untold, forever buried behind silence, fear, or shame? The mechanisms of control, obedience, isolation, secrecy, are subtle, and human empathy, trust, and privacy often allow them to persist. And so, we return to the opening theme: the family, the very unit society relies upon for protection, may also be a place of horror. The walls that are meant to comfort may conceal suffering. The hands that are meant to guide may manipulate. The voices that are meant to teach may deceive. The duality is uncomfortable, yet unavoidable. Sanctuary and nightmare exist side by side, sometimes in the same household, sometimes in the same moment. History demonstrates a grim truth: evil does not always announce itself. It often hides behind love, loyalty, and devotion. It waits patiently in silence, behind locked doors, behind polite facades, behind traditions, rituals, and rules. And while some of these horrors have been uncovered by chance, we can only imagine how many remain hidden. How many doors remain locked today, with secrets that may never be found? How many children continue to live in worlds shaped entirely by fear, obedience, and control? The answers are unknowable. The silence is total. And the horror, like the family itself, is intimate, enduring, and impossible to ignore once glimpsed. Because in the end, the question remains: what is a family? A sanctuary, a nightmare, or both, depending entirely on who holds the keys.